So we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14 today. Ephesians 3, beginning in verse 14. There we go. I will go ahead and tell you that I struggled a little bit in the preparation of this lesson because I felt like there's such a intense amount of text to cover. And maybe I'm the only one that actually said that, but it seems like we cover a lot of text, and this is some deep text. So then what happened was I would try and start studying something, and then I'd say, no, I've got this I need to cover too, and I've got this I need to cover too, and the next thing I know, I really haven't covered any of it very well. So Greg, I'm confessing now, at least in front of you, that I may need the extra help on that. So, but do know that we're going to have a good time with our discussion today. Ephesians chapter 3, this is, as he mentioned a little bit, this is straddling the dividing line between the first half of the book and the latter half of the book, and really the intended outcome of both. The first one being more on the teaching side of things, the latter half being more on the application side of things. So looking at Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14, for this reason, what does that mean, or what does that say?
Whatever he said before to that point is the reason for him saying what he's saying next.
Everything he said before, it's kind of like the word therefore. And I always love that definition. You always ask, what is it there for? But in this moment, when we come to a phrase like for this reason, he's having us look back to everything he's talked about before, and then he's going to give us a summary point, what this really means. Now, as you're looking back, what do you see in the back? What do you see from chapters 1, 2, and 3?
Chapter 2 makes the classic statement, you're saved by grace through faith and not by works.
Which would be a direct argument, if you will, towards the Jewish mindset of, no, we've got to do this by works. We're going to be doing this certain way. So saved by faith, not by works. What else? Chapters 1 through 3.
Chapter 2 would go on to say you are to do good works.
You are to be doers of those good works.
And some chapter in here will talk about how that Jesus has created one new man or one new crew by the cross. No longer Jew and Gentile.
Yeah. We're going to get into that a little bit later in Genesis, but Greg is bringing up the comment, which, can y'all hear Greg?
Yeah, it's coming through.
Is it? Okay, well, perfect. I won't repeat them. So when we look at this phrase, for this reason, I'm looking to realize that Paul is talking to a group of people who he's emphasizing that the Spirit has been poured out upon the Gentiles. They have received the gospel according to faith, and that they are now fellow heirs of the promise. I'm looking at it from that perspective. And so for this reason, Paul is telling us that the Gentiles as well are going to have a spiritual power, love, and knowledge, which is what I'm kind of seeing in verses 14 through the ending of the chapter. So really verses 3, 16 through 19, we see that there are a couple, what I'm going to say is about 4 major points here that kind of lead us through. And the first one's inner spiritual strength. The second one is indwelling of Christ in their hearts. The third is the ability to comprehend all the dimensions of spiritual realities. And the fourth is the knowledge of the love of Christ. I want to focus more on those latter 2 for today before we move into chapter 4. We come across this phrase that let's see, it's verse, there it is, verse 18, that you may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, the length, the height, and the depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. Who has an NIV translation? You do? Okay. Bill, would you mind reading the NIV's rendering of verse 18?
May have God together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ.
Would you read the start of verse 19 too, please?
And to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God.
Thank you very much, Bill. When you hear the phrase, or a phrase like breadth, length, height, and depth, what do you see? What comes to your mind?
Unlimited.
Unlimited. This, how can you touch the ends of it, if you would? Unlimited. What else? You know, when we think about this phrase in this context, it is this idea that how could you ever put God in a box? And particularly, how could you put the love of God in a box? Because if you did, how could you ever measure the distance from left to right or up and down? What I ask for the NIV's rendering is the NIV does something here that I can't say that I disagree with, because I think it's accurate, but I also say, well, most other translations don't do that. What it is that at the end of verse 18, they define what the height, depth, length, and width is. They define that as the love of Christ. That's why I say I don't think it's necessarily wrong, because verse 19 starts off with the love of Christ. The original or some of the other translations don't give us an actual definition of what is unmeasurable. So I find that interesting that the NIV took the liberty to do that, but it gives us this idea of a multi-dimensional God who has both power. That's coming from Ephesians chapter 1, verse 19. That he is rich in mercy, Ephesians 2, verse 4. That he lavishes his grace, Ephesians 2, 7 and 3, 7. And that he's rich in wisdom, Ephesians 3, verses 10. So when we come to this all-expansive God, I then come to the question that's really asked in verse 19, or that's at least perplexing, is when it says to know the love of Christ. What does that mean? Is it that we know the love of Christ? Or is it that, let me read it the way I wrote it. Does it mean that either Christ's love for us or our love for him? Christ's love for us?
This is a revolutionary statement Paul's making here. It's you see the word all in here several times in the last few verses there. It's all inclusive. And that's something that goes against the grain for Israel. But that's something that's passed on to us now. If we practice that word a little better than we should, it would probably solve a few problems.
So if we knew the love that Christ had for us, how would that change our life? And anyone's free to answer that question.
I think if we really realize what the power he's given us with the Holy Spirit, It's given us the Holy Spirit. If we really teamed up with the Spirit, you can't help but change your life. You know, that was what was special about Christ. You know, anybody could see, even the sinner, the agnostic, anyone, they could look at it. This man's different. The thief's on the cross. This guy's different.
So when we think about this love that God has for humanity, and I come across this phrase, how can we ever measure the height, depth, length, or breadth of it? I ask myself, if I truly understood that love, would I live differently? And I have to say that I believe if I truly understood, if I could grasp it, which I don't think the human mind has the capability, but if I could grasp it, I would live differently. If I could grasp even a portion of it, would I live differently? And then I come across the idea that he says here, it says, to know this love surpasses knowledge. What does that say to you? To know the love of Christ.
There's a lot of things we can learn, but to have that love, it's almost like breathing. We've taken it on. It's become part of our life. And I would say that all of us live a changed life in the church. You know, we all have accepted that love and practice it in different ways. I don't know if it's right, but our knowledge is different at different levels.
Well, you know what verse comes to my mind is 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It says, if I have all knowledge, if I have all faith, that I could move mountains, if I could do anything in all the world, if I could be Superman, but if I don't do it in love, what am I? Clanging gong, sounding cymbal, I'm nothing. And you're right, Chris. What Chris was saying is that we can learn a lot of stuff, but if that stuff learned is not held in the application of love, then it really has gained me nothing.
Doesn't it also mean that we can't fully understand this love?
I think it also implies that when we don't fully understand, we can still have that confidence in his love.
You know, I have a pea-sized brain in the comparison of godly wisdom. Maybe I'm probably not even a pea size. I'm probably like a flake of dandruff size brain in the scope of God's wisdom and God's love. And I think the question is, that's a great question. That's why, to me, I look at this verse and I say that knowing this love surpasses knowledge. I don't know if we have the capability to understand it. But I do know that whether it is God's love for us or our love for him, that when we truly know it, it's greater than anything in all the world. Which also leads me back to the book of Proverbs then. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so to know God is knowledge. And we can seek after all of the things of this world. We could seek after everything that we would think is valuable. But if we're not doing those things out of love, and if we're not doing those things out of a seeking and desire of God, we are gaining nothing. Something that I want to point out before we move into chapter 4. I didn't think I'd have enough material to talk. Here we are. In verses 14 through 21, Almost every word in this account is a plural case, meaning that when Paul is writing, he's not writing for us to read it on an individual level. Not that it can't be read individually. Not that I could not read 14 through 21 and say, well, he is talking to me. However, to be honest, when I read that, every word is plural, meaning that he is talking to a group of people, to a church of people. So when we talk about for us as a community to know the strength of God, for the love of God, for us as a community to live in this verse 16 according to the riches of his glory, to have a grasp of that, to have the grasp of the strength of the power through the Spirit, for us as a community to live in that reality changes from just my self-understanding or just my self-knowing to that as a whole church of people we are to know. And so when I think about that, I realize that this gives us as a congregation, verse 16 says it's a matter of strength. Verse 17 gives us this idea of the indwelling of Christ in the heart of a congregation of people. Verse 18, that this life together as a Christian, that we're going to find our world is far bigger because of God. And that finally, going into verse 19, we know then that the love of God surpasses all forms of knowledge. So God accomplishes all of his strength and power and capability for us today by the power that is at work where? Verses 20 and 21. Through the church. He accomplishes power, to quote it, through us, this power that is far exceeding our expectation, that is in us, that we are joined together with the glory of God forever. So when I read verses 14 through 21 now, I'm realizing the call that Paul is having is for the church to exhibit all of these actions, because the power that's working within me is far more abundant than all we can ask or think, according to the power that's worked within us. Then 21 is kind of a doxology, to him be the glory. I like verse 20. To him who's able to do far more abundant. Why would Paul mention that phrase, verse 21, to a church like Ephesus? (20 and 21).
I think he done it to give us strength. And I'm like you, I can't even start to imagine God's love and the length of that, and his knowledge of everything. And he gives me hope, and he gives me security knowing he's there. That don't mean I don't go through hard times. That don't mean that there's not any sorrow in life. But he's there for us. And I firmly believe he won't give you more than you can handle.
If we could live our lives knowing that the power of God that's working within us is far greater than we can imagine, yet again, what is possible? What could be accomplished in a people, in a person or in a people who see the power of God working and are open to what he can do and are open to what can be accomplished through him? Yeah, Roger.
I think it's a call for us to think bigger. Our God's too small. We don't imagine like we should. We don't have enough faith as a church as we should. And I think it's not only an encouragement to us, but it's a challenge for us to think bigger.
The
like that.
concept in the book of Ephesians that Christ through the cross created one new man, no longer Jew, no longer Gentile. That transcended lots of barriers that I don't think we have anything remotely close to imagining. So maybe that's part of it.
To see I appreciate you bringing us back to the Ephesian context, to see the divide that existed in their world. And you're right, as much divide as there may be for us today, I don't know if that same divide or that same level is what they've experienced. And that's a perfect segue then into chapter 4. Because what's the first section of chapter 4 talking about? So if anyone can accomplish unity among a people who have despised each other for years, who is it? Christ can. If anyone has the power to do it, and I'm going to run out of time, but we're going to go as far as we can. We start in verses 1 through 6. And what I'm seeing here is that there is a fundamental idea that Christians are a united people. There is one body, verse 4 would say. There's, let me go back. There's one body, one spirit, just as you were called to one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who's over all and through all. This idea of oneness. Now, when you've heard this text preached before, what do we typically focus on? Or what have you probably heard the focus be, the emphasis be? The one church. And so we'll make a big to-do about the one church. And what I see Paul is writing to is he's writing to a group of people who basically live like they're 2 or 3 churches. And he says, that's not the way that you're to live. We are supposed to be a fundamentally Christian united front. In the bonds of peace, verse 3 would say. Going into verses 7 through 11, what I see Paul alluding to, or Paul telling us, is that even within our unity, there's going to be diversity. And that's okay. We don't all have to agree with the exact same thing on all things. We can have diversity. And what I see him doing in this text is introducing really that topic of the Spirit into it and realizing spiritual gifts, that everyone is different. We all have a different spiritual gift, and that's kind of where I see the focus moving in chapter 4, is that this unity does not imply uniformity. It does not imply that we are all the exact same, but it's that we will perform a ministry that is united behind the Christ. Spiritual gifts, this is verse 7, are given to whom? Everyone. That's a question on your handout if you're following your actual handout. So if spiritual gifts are given to everyone, what does that mean? Have you ever heard someone who said, that's not my gift, or I don't have a gift? And I know those are 2 separate statements. To think about the people, and maybe even the people at Oklahoma Church of Christ, who do not live to the gift that they've been given, or maybe don't even seek. Maybe that's where churches fail. Maybe that's where we don't understand the power of God, is because we don't see the Spirit of God and how it works within us. Just throwing out a hypothetical. You go further into verse 7, that the spiritual gifts are gifts of grace. Grace was given. And what I see as we move, for speed up time here, I see as we move on down this idea that spiritual gifts are not given primarily to benefit the individual. A person was not given the ability of administration, let's say, so that they could be a really good administrator and they could succeed in the corporate world. Spiritual gifts were given so that they would benefit whom? They'd benefit others. So they would benefit the verses 14 through 21, the plural, that we're all a part of this together. So the spiritual gifts given are so that we can all be benefited from the work that's occurring. So if we were all the same person, if everyone was just like Cynthia, what would the church look like? What strengths would the church have? What's that? We would all be of one mind. That's right. That's right. What else? Cynthia, I think you have a gift of administration. We would be an administered church like no church has ever been seen before.
We'd all be bookkeepers.
We'd all be bookkeepers. Boy, those numbers would line up, wouldn't they? Now, let me ask you this. If this is a church entirely consisted of a whole bunch of Cynthias, not that this is down on Cynthia, but what would the church miss? What would we lack?
All the other things.
All the other things. Where would the fishing person be? Who would go out on the lake and fish? So when I look at closing out in Ephesians chapter 4, what I see the point being is that in this diversity of gifts, the diversity of gifts have to lead us to unity. The reality that I cannot, he used in the video the example of like cutting your finger. The person who hurts is the body. The person who hurts is me. We have to have the diversity of gifts in order to have a united front. If everyone tried to act like someone else, we fail. I guess unless you're trying to act like Jesus Christ, that's a success. But beyond that, if we all try to act like some person, we fail. But that's where the blessing comes in our diversity. By being different, we bring different things to the table, and then our group becomes stronger. Any final comments or thoughts before we close out? Well, thank you all very much for joining online today or for being here in person. Very appreciative of that. We'll be transitioning over for our worship service here in about 15 minutes then.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Bruce.